your shorter than average girl from down under, and today we're going to be analyzing the third book in the Dragons of Deltora series, The Isle of the Dead. Now, if you haven't seen the analyses for the first or the second book in this series, then you can go to the Deltora Quest playlist and check them out. As for this book, well, this book is all about tragedy. There aren't any new villains or conspiracies introduced. Instead, we see the truest form of victimhood, those who are suffering under tyranny. However, these people don't act like victims. They are the ones who stick strong to their principles and do the right thing, even if it means it's at the expense of their own life or the life of their loved ones. This book also does a lot to tie off loose ends with characters that we've been introduced to by showing us their past and their eventual fates. It's sad, it's tragic, but it's also full of hope. So if you're only here for the book review, then you can skip to the time shown on the screen right now or the timestamp in the description, whichever suits you best. But for now, let's talk stories. Dread Mountain, where Leaf, Barda, and Jasmine are writing to Doom again, essentially telling them that where they are and that they are going to be heading to Tora. They make sure that no one really knows so that it doesn't get leaked, and they hop into the pouches of Prin, Bruna, and Ilsa to head to Tora. Unfortunately for them, the Emerald Dragon isn't too happy about Leaf taking the emerald out of its territory, so he chases them down. They think that they're going to get away with it as long as they cross into the Amethyst territory, but the Emerald Dragon crosses over anyways. Now, this is where Jasmine points out the absolute hypocrisy of the Emerald Dragon, where he got angry that the Lapis Lazuli Dragon crossed over, but it was okay for him to cross into the Amethyst territory. Respecting the hustle, the Emerald Dragon lets them go, but Leaf ain't too happy about Jasmine confronting the dragon. So they get into a fight, but I mean, that's not going to help their situation. If they want to fly to Tora, they need to find a new high platform for the kin to take off again. And so they find the Bone Point Lighthouse, which is haunted. While they're making their way to the viewing platform, they start to see visions of the past, I guess you can call them, because they're not exactly ghosts, but essentially they see the previous occupants of the lighthouse, a man named Red Han and his daughter Verity. One day we see a captain of a ship named James Gant playing cards with Red Han. When Red Han doesn't have any money to offer over, James Gant asks him to turn the lighthouse off. When Red Han refuses, Grant ends up taking Verity. Verity is tied to the bow of the Lady Luck, which is James Gant's ship, which is mooring offshore to taunt Red Han. Now the thing is, we've met James Gant before, but by a different name, Laughing Jack. Laughing Jack, or James Gant, is actually a servant of the Shadow Lord, and one of the things that the Shadow Lord asked him to do was to make sure that Deltora was cut off from the world. One thing that would achieve that is turning off the lighthouse to make sure no ship can actually survive the tumultuous waters to the west of Deltora. Now, that was all of the visions that they saw for now, so they were up in the air again. However, the winds were too strong and the kin were being pushed offshore instead of towards land. Now, that's problematic, because Leaf can't actually take the belt of Deltora outside Deltora. The further away they're being pushed, the warmer and warmer the belt was getting around his waist. Burning level warm. It was so bad that Prin was actually starting to squirm because she can feel the heat of the belt inside her pouch. To save Prin's life, Leaf jumps out. Of course, when they saw this, Barda jumps straight after him, but Jasmine doesn't because she doesn't know how to swim. Leaf and Barda end up on the deck of the haunted Lady Luck. And this is when they start seeing more visions of what happened to Verity. As she was tied up at the bow, birds were feeding her berries, making sure that she kept alive. And the more and more that James Gant pressured her and her father, the more adamant she was to stay true so that her father could keep his promise to Deltora. When the crew had kind of had enough of Verity's suffering, they tried to free her, but James Gant wasn't going to have any of that. Verity warned them that James Gant is going to betray them. Then came the fateful day that the Akbaba attacked. That was the day that James Gant got the message that he could just head back into Deltora and be the mischievous man that he was. Turned out that the Lady Luck was actually a gambling ship, a mobile casino. And of course, every single game on the Lady Luck was impossible to win. And now that he doesn't have to stay offshore, he was going to head into the Doran River to scam some Deltorans. But he needed his crew to man the oars, and they weren't going to have any of that as long as Verity was still on board. So he makes a deal with them. He promises them freedom as long as they row all the way back into the Doran River, and that everyone will get an equal share of the money, with James not touching a single coin. But of course, this is when Verity's premonition comes true, and the entire crew are still stuck in the bows of the Lady Luck, cursed to continue to row it forever and ever. Now, for Leaf and Barda to get off the Lady Luck, they also needed to beat the games inside this portable casino. But as I said before, it was impossible to win these games, to the extent that the lapis lazuli wasn't even working, because you couldn't win these with luck. They were rigged. But lucky for them, it was Verity's memories and her art which helped them escape and made sure they didn't end up lost and manning the oars of the Lady Luck. After they escape, they made it to the Sleeping Dunes, where they find a very ill amethyst dragon. So it turns out that all the way at the beginning, when they were being chased by the Emerald Dragon and they crossed into the territory, the Amethyst Dragon had waken up. But because he'd been asleep for so many years, sand had compiled on top of him. But as soon as Leaf and Barda were put onto the Lady Luck, the power of the amethyst wasn't working for him, and so he couldn't actually escape from the sand dunes. So he had been there for days and weeks, just breathing in sand and falling more and more ill. By the time that they got to him, he was dying. That's when Jasmine, some Taurans, Manus, and Ranesh, who now lives in Tora with his pregnant wife Marilyn, end up finding them, and they free the Amethyst Dragon with their magic. Now that our trio have reunited, they have to make their way to the Sister of the West in the Isle of the Dead. But they didn't want anyone to be concerned, so they decide that they're going to sneak out at night. The Amethyst Dragon was in no condition to help them at this point, but he did tell Leaf his name, saying that if he simply called upon it, he'd be able to come if they needed any help. And his name was Veritas. Just before they were about to sneak out, they receive a letter from none other than Tom. So, in this letter, Tom was super vague, but he said that he's now obliged to help them now that they were getting involved in his business. And to accompany this lovely and inconspicuous message, he gave them a bunch of fire beads and a box of mints. So, what is this business, you're probably wondering about? Well, it turns out that Tom has a sister named Ava, and Ava lives on the peninsula which overlooks the Isle of the Dead. Now, don't even ask me how Tom knew this, but anyways, he said that if they gave Ava the mints, she would help them out. Turned out that Ava was blind. She's somewhat of a fortune teller, and the only way that she sees is by premonitions in the future. After giving Ava the mints, she gives them a clanky old boat. It was only enough for them to make it to the island between the peninsula and the Isle of the Dead. A island full of lilies. Lilies that suck on your blood. And unfortunately for them, they found the skeletal remains of the diamond dragon. This poor dragon had laid down to rest, and the blood lilies had done to it what they will. But lucky for them, the diamond dragon had laid an egg. At Leaf's touch, the egg cracks and a cute baby diamond dragon comes out. Of course, this dragon was not going to be very useful to them when they're fighting the Sister of the West, so Leaf calls upon Veritas to come. As they're crossing over the land bridge which connects the island of the Blood Lilies with the Isle of the Dead, they are attacked by a sea creature known as the Cob. And this is when Veritas comes in and saves the day. The Sister of the West was inside the cave, which originally belonged to the Cob, but now housed the guardian of the sister. A guardian Veritas was all too familiar with, Doran. Yes, Doran the Explorer, friend of the Perrons and the Dragons, was turned into the sister's guardian through the Shadow Lord's curse. Now, the sucky thing about Doran's curse is that he is fully conscious of who he is, and he absolutely hates the fact that the sister is embedded in his chest, keeping him alive, but there's nothing he can do about it. He is stuck, bound to the seat that he is sitting on, and has nothing except his memories to keep him company. Veritas and Doran's meeting was very bittersweet, and Doran begs Veritas to end his suffering. And with a very, very heavy heart, he does. The sister's pulsing jelly comes out of Doran, and he destroys that as well. Leaf, Barda, and Jasmine take the remains of Doran and they bury them. But that's when they find out Ava's not really Ava. It's Laughing Jack in disguise. So the big plot twist of this book is that Tom, Ava, and Laughing Jack, aka James Gant, are actually siblings. And because they are from the Opal tribe, just like Stephen and Nevitz, they have some kind of like telepathic connection to one another. They can communicate in their minds. And so when Tom felt that his brother Laughing Jack had met the trio and Ava had a premonition that the trio were going to come to her, he felt like he was obliged to help out. Crazy, I know. But now Ava was Laughing Jack's hostage, and so the trio were adamant to save her. That's when Laughing Jack grabs Jasmine and almost ends things there. What he didn't know was inside Jasmine's stash of gold was a coin that Leaf had won from the Lady Luck. And if you remember, the promise that James Gant had made to his crew was that he wouldn't take a single piece of their treasure. And now that he had, the Lady Luck had appeared on shore, and Laughing Jack was swept into its bows, there to man the oars with all of the crew that despise him. A well-deserved ending indeed. It also turns out that the four horses pulling Laughing Jack's carriage were also familiar to them. Three of those horses were theirs from all the way back in Dragon's Nest, and the other transformed into a man, Red Han, for all these years after he has been torturing him this entire time. Now that Laughing Jack is gone, Red Han is now free to go back to the lighthouse and serve his king again. What a tragic but beautiful tale. This story aims to highlight heroes, people who would put everything on the line for the right cause. In fact, I would go as far to say this story highlights martyrs, people who die on the right cause, people who put their lives and their secrets on the line for loyalty. People like Red Han and Verity, Tom and Ava, and Doran. This is all contrasted with the betrayal and greed which stemmed from Laughing Jack, someone who gave up his country just for a little bit of coin. And even though Tom is also really greedy, as we probably know from the first series, he didn't sacrifice his loyalty to the kingdom. He didn't sacrifice his loyalty to home. And we see that by him helping the resistance out. And now Leaf, Barda, and Jasmine. And we can say the same thing about Ava. I mean, although we didn't really see much of her because she was kidnapped, in the next book we'll find that she also does what she can with her limited powers to also aid our trio. So let's start off by defining what a martyr is. A martyr is someone who is killed because of their beliefs. Someone who suffers persecution for advocating an ideal. Someone who refuses to renounce something that they hold dear. Now, it's very commonly used in the context of religion, but martyrdom isn't a religious concept. It's a concept of loyalty. It's a concept of believing in an ideal more worthy of surviving than yourself. In Verity's situation, she was willing to give herself up so that her father could keep that lighthouse open. And Red Han was willing to sacrifice not only his daughter, but also himself. Also, so that lighthouse could stay open and he can keep his oath to the king. Both believed in Deltora. They believed in the monarchy. Even though, we can all argue that the monarchy was pretty screwed up at the point where Red Han and Verity were serving it. No thanks to the Shadow Lord. But I mean, how were they going to know that? The idea is they believed in a united Deltora. They believed in the country that they were serving. And for that, they were punished. Punishment is used to essentially deter an individual from their ideals, essentially switching them into survival mode so that they would reject them in hopes of salvation. A martyr can only be someone who has the courage and strength to control their survival mode in order to ensure that this particular ideal and belief doesn't die out with them. And sometimes that comes with the expense of oneself. Most of the time, the stories of martyrs that we've heard have become infamous, and that's how they turn into the heroes that we love so much. But in truth, there are so many martyrs that we don't know about, whose stories weren't made into legends. That's because they're not written down in history. They weren't recorded. In this book, that's what we see. No one knew where Red Han had gone. No one knew Verity even existed because she only lived in the lighthouse with her father. And no one knew what had happened to Doran. The Shadow Lord had ensured that their history would be wiped off, and he embedded rumors here and there, talking about how Red Han had betrayed the king and left his position, running away with his daughter, or that Doran had gone mad and then killed himself. Neither were true, but as a consequence, their life, their legacy, and their legendary status as martyrs was never discovered by anyone in Deltora. Well, until the trio found out. This is a necessary step for people who are trying to squander ideas and ideals, because martyrs will live on forever. That is how the ideal or the belief stays alive. All they have to do is make sure that the perspective is changed, that people do not perceive these individuals as heroes or as martyrs. They change the narrative. Once they do that, new hope dies out, and the cycle of new heroes, new hope being reborn is broken. Yeah, it worked for quite a while, but the thing is, you can't erase the truth, nor can you erase the positive outcome of the eventual sacrifice. Those visions in the lighthouse, they were the magic which preserved the truth, allowing Barda and Leaf in particular to be able to see all the events that unfolded and therefore herald Red Han and Verity as the heroes that they are. Not to add, Verity's paintings were there to aid them to escape the Lady Luck, the positive outcome of her loyalty. And then when it came to Doran, even though he had suffered for so long, he never gave in to the darkness. His body may have been in the control of the Shadow Lord, but his mind was still free. And through all that agonizing pain of memories and suffering, he still had the final win by giving them a free pass to destroying the Sister of the West, even at the expense of himself. All our lively rebels of the Shadow Lord did what they did, suffered what they suffered, to ensure that hope stays alive. to ensure that Deltora had a chance of getting through this evil. And what I really like about the progression of the story is how we see this cycle reflected in the dragons that we're introduced to. At the beginning, we have the Emerald Dragon again, the Dragon of Honor, because our ideals and beliefs stem from our honor. We then move on to the Amethyst Dragon, the Dragon of Truth, reflecting the next step in which Barda and Leaf were uncovering the events which had occurred in the past, helping them to make a fuller picture of the situation and restoring that honor that Red Han, Verity, and Doran had lost through the Shadow Lord's lies. But at the same time, it is also a reflection of what all three of these characters sacrificed for, preserving the truth of what was happening to the land. And finally, even though we go through this huge emotional roller coaster where there is so much sadness and death, there is always new hope born through the egg of the diamond dragon. Yes, I do know that the diamond is a symbol of strength and the opal is a symbol of hope. I get it. But I'm talking about the whole concept of rebirth and, after the despair that they felt from seeing the skeletal remains of the diamond dragon, a cracking egg was that renewed energy that they needed to continue on with their quest. And I guess you can link in strength for someone to move from taking the truth and applying it. It requires courage. It requires strength. That's not an easy step to take. It requires one to completely shed their personal ambitions for a greater cause and a greater good. Not something that everyone can actually achieve. Staying on the road of truth is a very lonely and terribly difficult task. It demands a lot of sacrifice, a lot of suffering, and a lot of pain. The reason for that is the truth is independent of us. We are merely conduits or vessels for the passage of the truth from one generation to another. There are going to be some of us who prefer our personal comfort and ease, blocking the passage of the truth from one generation to another, in hopes that we would live a somewhat happy and safe life. Now, there are going to be some of us that aren't simply vehicles of the truth, aka a middleman in Chinese whispers who just passes it from one ear to another. There are going to be some of us who use the truth in action, like Leaf, Barda, and Jasmine. But that's not everyone's potential or mission. It requires a level of skill to be able to know what to do with it. Just because you're not at that level, it doesn't mean that the truth isn't worth preserving. So we should endeavor to ensure that it is preserved, it is recorded correctly, and it is safeguarded so that it does reach those who do know how to use it. I absolutely love this message from AC Revelations. It's kind of one of my main takeaways from this franchise.
I have lived my life as best I could, not knowing its purpose, but drawn forward like a moth to a distant moon. And here at last, I discover a strange truth. That I am only a conduit for a message that eludes my understanding. Who are we, who have been so blessed, to share our stories like this? To speak across centuries? Maybe you will answer all the questions I have asked. Maybe you will be the one to make all this suffering worth something in the end. Now, listen.
Truth first, personal missions and ambitions second. As a child, I personally found this book really difficult to read. It's very sad and very somber, which I didn't particularly enjoy. Which actually meant that I haven't reread this book until I was making this video. Rereading it now, I do have a great appreciation for the values that this book imparts. I appreciate the somber tone and the many deaths and sacrifices shown in the narrative. So depending on a child's tolerance to sad themes, averted justice, and also death, This may be one to skip for the moment. I mean, there's a reason why it's called the Isle of the Dead. So if that's not something a child has come to terms with and understands that there is more to this journey that we're on than life, then they aren't going to really take away the message of self-sacrifice and martyrdom too kindly. I recommend assessing the child's tolerance and threshold to kind of like sad themes and stuff before jumping into this one. That was the Isle of the Dead. I hope you enjoyed this video and that even though it was very, very sad, you can still see the light in the darkness. If you did enjoy this video, please make sure to give it a like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on the last review for Deltora Quest. And that is very bittersweet to say. So be brave, be happy, and be kind, and we'll catch you all next time.